What's the most hilariously unexpected plot twist you've encountered in real life? I was in Japan and ran into a guy from Alaska. Told him I worked in Alaska years ago for a while. We became friends and I was showing him some of my Alaska pics and he got the weirdest look. I asked what? He said, "That's me in the background of your picture." I took a random picture of a memorial while he was walking in the background and we both discovered the fact while in Japan. Still makes me feel weird. I was first on scene to a bad motorcycle accident. A car missed a stop sign and TV1'd the motorcyclist. I stopped immediately. So did the car behind me. And a car in the opposite lane. This was a rural road in the middle of nowhere. The woman in the car behind me jumped down into the ditch with me and the victim took off her head scarf and tied a tourniquet on his nearly amputated leg. The other guy came over with a large med kit bag, and while he was putting on gloves, said to the woman, "Hey, I know you, don't I?" Quote. "Yep, we've met a couple times." Quote. The woman said to me, "I'm an off-duty officer. He's EMS. What are the chances?" A country road, middle of nowhere, and police and EMS both on scene immediately. If it was a TV show, I wouldn't have believed it. Biker may not ride again, but he survived. Was studying in my uni library one day minding my own business when the guy in the seat next to me popped his head round the partition and silently offered me Cheetos. I'd never met this person before in my life and wasn't a huge fan of Cheetos, so I politely turned him down. Fast forward several months, I'm on a bus coming back from a whole different state. The bus is relatively empty and there was no assigned seating. An hour in, the guy sitting in front of me gets onto his knees on the chair and turns around. It's the same dude from the library that one time. And what does he do? Stick his hand out and offer me Cheetos. In primary school we had a World War I memorial lesson and we were asked if anyone had any relatives who fought at the time. My friend brought in a picture of his great-great-grandfather with his wife. A girl also brought in a picture of her great-great-grandfather with his wife. The teacher said they looked similar. She put them side by side and looked shocked. We gathered around and it was the same man who had kept his two wives a secret. Both had been married privately. They were cousins and didn't know. My grandma and grandpa turned out to be from warring families. No joke, 40 people died on both sides. The feud was ongoing from 1870 to like 2003, but none of us knew about it. They got divorced 15 years into their marriage, so not too surprising. 20 years ago I was a regular on an online law forum. Admin was a lawyer from a town 500 kilometers away. He occasionally shared anecdotes about his goofy secretary. At the same time I met a woman I became close friends with. She told me anecdotes about her goofy best friend who was a secretary for a law firm. Turns out the goofy best friend and the goofy secretary are the same person. And it was interesting to hear the other side. Apparently the lawyer was an alcoholic. My friends and I were in the Everglades and they wanted to go hiking. I felt so scared because of the gators and nowhere to go on the trail. So I stayed by the truck to wait and smoke. I almost saw a guy get killed by a gator in the parking lot. Edit. I realize I left out the meat of the story. My bad. The guy bent down way too close to a big gator who was sunbathing. Went to take a pic. Camera said, click. Gator snapped at him and rolled into the lake so fast the guy had half jumped back. Half fallen on his ass just out of the range of the alligator before it rolled. Guy was okay. Gator was okay. So my parents and I were on holiday on the other side of the world from where we live. And we were in one of those places that's very isolated and only has a few people staying there at the time. It was dinner time. and we were mingling with the other guests. I was sitting by the fire, making small talk with a random woman. In the course of the conversation, I mentioned where I went to school, and she got the shock of her life. As her son was in my year, I asked his name, and it turned out to be a classmate I knew quite well. If that was the end of the story, it would be weird enough as it was. But when I called my mother over and told her the weird coincidence, she started chatting to the woman as well. And over the course of the conversation, they made a second big discovery: they had been classmates at school as well. The thing is, they didn't go to school in the same country as us. They had gone to school in southern Africa. Classmate and I had gone to school in Europe, and we were in Southeast Asia when we met. I'm good friends with a couple, and while I met them while we all lived on the West Coast. The husband grew up in my Midwestern town, is my age, and we've learned that we've shared space when we were younger without knowing it. His parents, also from and still living in the same Midwestern town, came over to my house one year. For Thanksgiving, I posted pics on Facebook. My sister messages me and asks why Dr. Friend's dad is having dinner at my house. Evidently, the dad was both my nephew's child psychologist when he was a kid. He's an adult now, and my niece's current psychologist. She's still a kid, 15-year age difference. It's like our families are meant to be together. On a vacation several hundred miles from home, I'm wearing an athletic shirt with my unusual last name on it. A tourist behind me says, "Hello. Do you happen to know XYZ, my last name?" I said yes. That's my uncle. Turns out he was the same age as my dad. Grew up in my hometown and moved to my dad's hometown after college. He and my dad had a ton of overlapping friends, to the point where he had stayed overnight in my current room 20 years before during a sleepover. I ran into an old friend at a music festival and he asked if I knew of a bluegrass band he could hire to play at a private event. I told him no. Later that day I was jamming with some people and ended up agreeing to fill in on a couple of gigs. A couple of weeks after telling the guy the first didn't know any bands, I show up at his event as the bass player in the band he hired. I didn't put the two things together till I asked where to set up. This wasn't a small community. It was at a hotel party room in Nashville and I live 80 miles away. Also, I didn't know who the banjo player was till I got there. It was my sister's ex-fiancé who I hadn't seen in 15 years, but he had been to my house. Kids' b-day parties, etc. Divorced my husband 36 years ago. Best thing I ever did. The day I put his stuff in the front yard and changed the locks, someone set him up on a blind date. He ended up moving in with her immediately and they've been together ever since. Years later, one of our daughters got into Ancestry.com and started mapping all of our families. Come to find out, the woman he married is actually a cousin of mine. Turns out all three of us were originally from a little town in Florida. She and I share a great-grandfather. I am descended from his illegitimate family and she is descended from the legitimate family. Then we find out my ex-husband is related to both of us. We're all distant cousins. I was on a work trip, single at the time, and this guy started flirting with me. At first I was interested, but I did a little digging and found out he was married with kids. When I confronted him, he got really nasty towards me and I avoided him the rest of the trip. I heard through the grapevine that my rejection didn't stop him from cheating on his wife with others. Fast forward a year later, I find out cheater had been let go from his job due to budget cuts. At this point I had started dating my now husband. When I met my Phil, I learned that not only do Phil and I work in the same field. Phil is cheater's former boss. When we were talking about mutual people we know and cheater's name popped up, I made a comment about how he sucks and cheats on his wife. Phil goes, interesting. He just called me yesterday to see if we're hiring again. Happy to report that cheater hasn't been rehired. A doctor was really mean to me and giving me the side eye because she didn't like it when I asked if it was possible for me not to take meds for her diagnosis until the test results came back. She tried to handle me out of her clinic, which took me by surprise, and I had to grab my jacket before I was pushed out of the room. In the madness, my work ID badge fell out of it and she picked it up, then went very pale. She realized I was a senior manager at the same hospital as her. She was nice as pie afterwards. My great-uncle was a Jesuit priest. He sort of always kept to himself. He was very serious. Bit of a curmudgeon. My dad gets a phone call in the middle of the night in 2005. Great-uncle says he needs my dad to pick him up immediately from Port Washington, Wisconsin. My dad drives from Indianapolis to Wisconsin to get my great-uncle. My great-uncle is living in a mansion on the water. My dad is trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Long story short, when my great-uncle was teaching at a well-known Jesuit university, he fell in love with a young woman and she with him. They secretly led a life together, and when he was 97 and she 80, she passed away. He had no idea what to do. They had always planned for him to die first, but to make this wilder, he still went about as a priest. He took the vow of poverty, hung out with priests, etc. Martha, his girlfriend, went big with IBM and became a millionaire. She took my great-uncle all over the world. They did fancy things. He even had a different name when he was with her. After she died, my great-uncle lived with my mom and dad. When my mom took him to the doctor, they couldn't find any of his records. After a few minutes, he said, "Oh, check under the name Peter Rockford." And they found him. My great-uncle was a total badass. I'm not sure he could get away with this today. Maybe he could. He lived to be 103. I worked in a bank many years ago, and we had brand new pop-up solid steel security screens that could be activated in the event of a hold-up robbery to barricade the staff safely behind the counter. We had the company arrive on the first morning after they were installed to show us how to use them. And a coworker asked what would happen if the robber jumped over the counter and somehow the screens activated, trapping them inside with the staff. That would never happen because the staff obviously wouldn't activate the screens. 6 hours later, an armed robber jumped the counter and pulled cash from the drawer, including the cash under the clip, which triggered the screen, trapping him inside. He screamed for the screens to be lowered. Everyone was on the floor and nobody moved. And then he saw the back door, which was supposed to be deadlocked but wasn't. No shots fired. Don't even know if it was a real gun. This was late 1980s. When I started high school, a guy in my class had the same, quite unusual, name as my childhood dog. To give you an idea of how rare the name is, only about 3 people in 100,000 have this name. My dad chose it as a tribute to his favorite football club. So, let's say the name was Burnley. I of course told my parents about the coincidence, and they thought I should tell my new classmate. I argued it would be weird to blurt out, "I once had a dog with your name." So I decided not to. A year passed and Burnley was now in my circle of friends. We had all gone to a party together and I was in earshot of my friends talking about how long it had been since they'd seen me and how they missed me. Weird. I've never known anyone with my name. Let's call me Adia. And, as far as I knew, they didn't know anyone else with my name either, as only about 40 people in 100,000 share it. They then said that they really wanted to pet me. The weirdness of it all got to me and I jokingly asked them what they wanted to do to me. To which they replied, "Oh, not you, Burnley has a cat called Adia." And that's the story of how I found out about the other Adia and Burnley of the other Burnley. My mother was on a jury duty when my sister and I were teenagers. It was a drug case. My mother said self-righteously she was thankful that her children weren't stupid enough to get involved in drugs. Well, both my sister and I were involved with things like that at the time. I stopped pretty young, but my sister didn't and ended up dying of an overdose at 30. Before that, my mom had no knowledge of her addiction. Thought I accidentally sent a text complaining about my boss to my boss. Turns out, it was actually my friend with the same name. Lesson learned. Always double-check the contact before venting. I had a local weed shop by me that was fire. The guy who ran it was an awesome dude as well. One day I'm in and it's pretty dead. Well, I bought some good stuff and got entered in a raffle. He asks if I could record it for his Instagram. No problem at all. Draw one for third place prize. Second draw for second place prize. And grand prize. He pulls the name and calls it out, and it was me. We both lost it and start yelling, "It's not rigged, it's not rigged." Lol. I came home with a ton of premium swag and weed. Mind was blown. His reaction was the coolest. His jaw dropped and couldn't stop smiling.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.